Good morning, everyone. I'm Jonathan Carwest. I'm Chief Executive of LGRU. I'm delighted to welcome you all here to another one of our Ask the Expert sessions. And like all the events in this series, this is exclusively for you as LGRU members. Those of you who have perhaps only experienced LGRU through our daily news emails or through our briefings, just as a reminder, we're the UK's biggest independent local government membership body. We were set up by 3 councils in England over 40 years ago now, but today we have more than 300 councils in membership across the UK, Ireland and Australia. And our purpose is to support local government, which means we're here to support you every day in the vital work that we know you are all doing in the communities across the country and across the world. And we have a team of experts and associates who are here on hand to keep you informed, to keep you engaged, to keep you connected, and indeed to keep you listened to through guidance on legislation, on key developments, through sharing learning. There's a lot to be doing. Now, today, we're covering a topic that's going to be on everyone's minds quite a lot this week. It's hard to believe, but it's actually already a week since we saw the results of the 2025 local elections coming in. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time, and we'll wrap up by 11. These are short and sharp. A little bit of time looking at what the results were, just as an overview, and what they might mean for local government. Now, before we begin, I've got a couple of housekeeping items. We're going to record the presentations from today's session so they can be made available afterwards. And then we will open up for Q&A after Greg, Hannah and I'll introduce our speakers in a minute after we go through some of our initial thoughts. So please do add questions to the chat and we will do our best to get to it. Now, before I introduce our experts for this morning, I just wanted to run over quickly some of the top lines of what happened last week and a sort of initial response from LGRU. So the overall results, we found interesting. We've done a lot of maps. We found this table perhaps gives the sort of clearest picture of the scale. And, these are pretty seismic local election results. As we can see, pretty much every council where there was clear control from either the Conservatives, and it was mainly Conservative councils up for election this time, or from Labour, is no longer controlled by that party. Lots of, many councils, Reform UK, now have an overall majority, and several councils have gone to no overall control, and indeed in some of those, Reform are the largest group. So a very, very big shift. No council that had clear control from one of the major parties at the beginning of this process still has it at the end of it, although there are places like Northumberland where the Conservatives are still the largest group, as they were before. Putting that in map form, I think, is quite interesting. And if we look at the council control after the map on the right-hand side, it's worth noting that line of blue down from the Wash through East Anglia, skipping London and down to the south coast, that is still blue. Those are places where elections were not held last week because they've been postponed pending devolution and local government reorganisation. Just to put it in graphic form, this was in areas that had elections on last week. This is the control before the elections, 62, 6 out of 10 controlled by the Conservatives. And this is afterwards. So Labour and the Conservatives sort of very much wiped from the full control map. But we shouldn't forget that, of course, it's only a selection of councils that had elections last week. If we look at the national picture, we can see that Labour still control 30% of the councils in the country. Conservatives on 11, Liberal Democrats on 12. Reform still only on 3% of councils in the country. But interesting that the biggest grouping now is councils under no overall control, 125 councils with NOC. And of course, that is not hugely different for us in local government. There were over 100 councils in no overall control before the election. So that it's, you know, a lot of the national media has sort of made a big deal about, oh, councils with no overall control. That's something we're very used to in local government. Combined authorities, four were up for election. Here, Labour held on to West of England. The Conservative Reform won the new mayoralties, combined authorities in Hull and East Yorkshire and Greater Lincolnshire, and Cambridgeshire and Peterborough went from Labour to Conservatives. Some regional results in the northeast. Northumberland remains no overall control. The Conservatives lost a few seats, but it remained the largest party. That's going to be one of the brighter spots of last week for them. Durham, previously, who's under overall control, overwhelmingly went to Reform. Northwest, Lancashire went from Conservative to Reform. Again, we see Reform going from 0 seats to 53 out of 84, so very clear majority. East Midlands, Nottinghamshire, Northamptonshire, West Northamptonshire, Derbyshire, Lincolnshire, all going from Conservative to Reform. Leicestershire, no overall control from Conservative, but Reform, the largest party. West Midlands, Shropshire, becoming Lib Dem. Worcestershire from Conservative to no overall control. Warwickshire, the same. Staffordshire from Conservative to Reform. In East Yorkshire, the only council that Labour were controlling, defending at the beginning of these elections, was taken by Reform, though we should note that Labour won the mayoralty. So you have a Labour mayor now, Ross Jones, and a Reform-led council. East of England, Hertfordshire, Conservative to knock. Cambridgeshire, Lib Dem. We see here in the southeast, Conservative to Reform. Oxfordshire from no overall control to Liberal Democrat. Buckinghamshire from Conservative to no overall control. In the southwest, Cornwall, still no overall control, but Reform the largest party, and some interesting negotiations there. Devon, Conservative to knock. Wiltshire, Conservative to knock. Gloucestershire, still knock. So some really pretty seismic changes. What does all this mean? And I think it's early to tell. You know, the dust is still settling somewhat. I think there is, across the political landscape of local government, there is certainly a degree of shock. We also see this means it's now been confirmed that Reform have enough councillors to qualify for a political group at the LGA. What we would say, I think, at LGIU is 2 points that we'd be keen to make. The first is, I've already made, that no overall control is a familiar process to councils. Councils have, and council officers have managed no overall control. We've seen rainbow coalitions. We've seen particularly mayors elected from outside the main three parties many times. So a lot of this, whilst it looks from the position of looking at national politics, it looks sort of completely unprecedented. And I don't want to downplay the significance of these changes, but it's not quite as uncharted territory for councils as it might appear. I think the second point I would make, and it's the one I make every year at local election time, is that these will be written up as as though they are about national politics. And of course, there is a significance for national politics, but these are not opinion polls. These are real elections. And the significance of these elections is that you now have new leadership in a whole swathe of county councils across England. These are organisations with massive budgets, hundreds of millions of pounds of budgets. These are organisations that deliver vital services, literally life and death services, adult social care, child protection. And what matters is what these changes do or do not mean for the delivery of services, the responsiveness to communities, the ability of those councils to serve their residents. And it's very, and we don't really yet know what that looks like. We've seen some early indications from Reform about their priorities, places where they want to cut spending. They've seen a focus on addressing waste, though I think many people will be skeptical. There's huge amounts of waste left to cut in most local authorities. How is that going to translate into an approach to statutory services? We don't know. How is that going to affect the local government reorganisation programme, which we're already in? All of these places had submitted initial proposals to government on March the 21st. So huge amounts of uncertainty at the moment. But I think what I would stress is that that is what matters. It's what matters in terms of the service delivery, in terms of the decision making about those local areas. And of course, there's a big challenge to get to grips with, which is that irrespective of party, we see a huge amount of new councillors, new leadership coming into local government right now. So there's going to be a huge job for officers in the sector to support new councillors to help them get to grips with really challenging portfolios. And I think that's not really part of the story that the national media tells about this, but it's hugely important, and it's certainly part of the picture, part of the story that LGIU wants to address. We have two expert speakers who are going to give us their reflections on last week's results. First up, Dr. Hannah Bunting, who's a lecturer of quantitative British politics at the University of Exeter. And some of you will have, Hannah's an old friend of LGIU and has been kind enough to contribute to many of our events. And so many of you will have seen her speak before and know how expert she is across a whole range of issues connected to local democracy, elections, and British politics. Hannah, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Yeah, I'm just going to echo a little bit some of the things that you were saying just there to start off with. I mean, we expected that these local elections would be difficult for the Conservatives. That's partly because of that 2021 boom year that we were sort of comparing to, and partly because they haven't really made headway in sort of convincing the public over the last few months. However, these really were conservative heartlands, so we weren't expecting the scale of change. As you've sort of already made clear, these are the most dedicated conservative voters who've probably voted conservative their whole life. Some of these areas have always been conservative, so we weren't really expecting that scale of the losses that they did suffer. So they're down more than 650 councillors, as you say, losing control of all of the councils that they led before last Thursday, and where this has been estimated, their estimated national vote was at just 18%. Almost all of these losses were to Reform and to the Liberal Democrats, who both had good nights to various different degrees, were depending on sort of the area and how you might want to benchmark that success. Both Labour and the Independents made net losses, the Greens having moderate success and winning their first councillors in some areas. So we obviously all know from the headlines that Farage's challenger party, Reform, came from nowhere, basically, and won a stonking set of councillors and councils, as those graphs really nicely just showed. But actually, when you dig deeper into these results, this was done on historically low levels of the vote. The vote shares for the winning party overall on average was 40.7%. And I looked, the election centre data goes all the way back to 1889. So I was looking, over 100 years to try and find something similar that had happened, and I couldn't. This really was unprecedented in terms of that winner's vote share. What that means is most people did not vote for the councillor that they got, right? And so we can ask a lot of questions about democracy and about local democracy and what that might mean in our electoral system. But yeah, the two-party vote as well, that's something else to mention. So what we mean by that is the Conservative plus the Labour vote share. That was also the lowest we've ever seen it in any local election. And the majorities that these councillors won on were also the smallest that it's ever been. So again, looking back all the way to 1899, trying to find something comparable, I really, really couldn't. Now, we call this fragmentation, which you probably will have seen in some of the headlines and some of the media coverage that's happened over the last week or so. And that is... and it actually mirrors exactly what we saw at the general election in terms of the mechanics of sort of the voting and how these people won these seats. So lots of seats won, but on a very low vote share. Of course, it was Labour at the general election, and this time most of the seats have gone to Reform. But I would stress that actually the public are not uniting around one party. Now, it might look like this because of the results and because the electoral system means that the winner's bonus means that they get lots of seats. But actually, we had a lot of areas where, say, Reform are on 23% and then Conservatives on 20 and Liberal Democrats on 19. So you've got almost the exact same number of people in that area voting for three different parties. It just so happened that there were a couple of votes that went more to Reform, and that happened in enough areas that they end up winning these, 670 odd seats. But yeah, I would really stress that even though the results look like it, actually the public have not united around one political force to sort of create that result. So what does this mean going forward? Well, obviously, there's now lots of new and mostly inexperienced councillors who honestly probably weren't expecting to win, who are now in these decision-making positions. And also, as we go through this period of local government reorganisation, and generally a relatively turbulent time for British politics, but also for local governments. And we all know the pressures that they're under. So those councillors, I'm talking particularly about Reform here, really, they need to get organised quite quickly. And one aspect of this is actually having the political savvy to be united front in the council chamber. Because we've seen before where you have new and inexperienced or, experienced in other ways, but new to a local government or any government role, that they can quickly fall into infighting. And there's wider trouble that follows that, right? So it's not even really just about learning the skills of, okay, what does it take to actually run a council, but having that political savvy to be, a faction and a united front so that there isn't this sort of infighting and fragmentation even within their own party group. But there's also this question about creating a party machine as well. So yes, Labour and the Conservatives, they've lost a lot of councillors who were great campaigners, looking to future elections. But they also have established organisational structures in all of those areas. It might be a constituency Labour Party or a Conservative organisation, which means that they can come back fighting. This is the same, of course, obviously, for the Liberal Democrats, who you could easily argue perhaps had the best night because not only did they increase their councillors, but they already have this party machine and this party engine behind them to keep improving on that result. Whereas Reform now need to build that machine after actually winning and concurrently while they're in these positions. And I guess that's part of their sort of transition from anti-establishment to sort of semi-establishment and then maybe full establishment, whatever we might end up calling that, which is not easy. They've got quite a task ahead of them now after this big victory, and not all of the public sort of uniting around them. So watching that is going to be, really interesting. No, I could keep going, but I'll stop there because I want to make sure that we've got lots of time for questions. But overall, I mean, it's a really fascinating stuff. And your members will know that although the media buzz might have died down for now, actually this is where the real work starts and all of these themes really start to come to fruition.
Yeah, that's very true, and there's certainly, we're already picking up a lot of awareness of that. A lot of people in local government saying in a completely non saying, right, this, there's a lot of work here. Now we have to sort of get on with it. I've got loads of questions, but I will be good and not exact. I'm going to introduce Dr. Greg Stride, who's an LGIU associate. He is the author of LGIU. Well, he was this year's author of LGIU's popular ones to watch, a report we bring out before the local elections every year, highlighting where we think the points of interest could be, and he's going to give us some reflections both on that and on the results more generally. Greg, how did we do on our ones to watch? Did we look at the right places?
Yeah, great question, Jonathan. Thank you very much. And thank you, Hannah, for your reflections on that. So, we've heard a lot of different perspectives in the last week, but the main one that we hear nearly all the time is what does this mean for the big national parties? And I instead am going to look at all the other different perspectives that you might have about, entering into looking at these elections. What different ways should we be looking at the results? And what different angles should we be taking to try to understand them? And Hannah has just given us some excellent reflections there. So I'm going to start off with, as Jonathan says, the very selfish perspective of what does it feel like to be someone who's trying to write a guide to these local elections ahead of time, which I had to do in early March, so a few months before. And I would say that the main issue that I had with writing this guide to what might be an interesting contest in the local elections was the same issue that everybody else had, which was that it was hard to believe that the polls would be accurate in terms of the buoyancy of Reform's vote, essentially. It looked at the time like the polls were quite volatile, like Reform's vote was going up and down, and the Conservatives and Labour were relatively steady, Labour lower than they had been, much lower than during the general election. And I was sort of thinking, okay, well, historically, the rise and fall of sort of more populist right parties would suggest that their polling is going to ebb and flow, and that probably the institutional advantages that the Conservative Party have in county council elections would suggest that they're likely to do a little bit better than we expect. In the end, they did much, much worse than I expected, which means that in writing a sort of list of all the interesting places to watch, the thing that made it easy was that there were very few places. So I only had to say, well, you can look here, look here, look here. There was only sort of 24 contests going on. The thing that made it very hard is that there was one very interesting story nearly everywhere, which was the collapse of the main party vote share. And as Hannah has pointed out, that wasn't exactly the story that it looks like, because it wasn't a collapse from something to nothing. It wasn't a collapse from total dominance to nothing. It was just a collapse below the point at which first past the post stops being an advantage and starts being a huge disadvantage, where you get that winner's bonus, in this case for Reform, which it saw in Labour areas in Doncaster and in Conservative areas across the county councils. So that's the first perspective that I want to talk about, is writing a guide to these local elections is quite hard because you had a look at everywhere and you said, oh, okay, well, the Conservatives are so dominant, it would take a real political earthquake to shake them out of their dominance in county councils. And that's pretty much what we got, basically, is that things were really, really different, but in a way that, as Hannah has described, is quite fragile. There's lots bubbling under the surface of the sort of 30-40% mark of these elections. And that's something that I think we should keep in mind. The second perspective that I want to talk about is in terms of the electoral systems. If you're primarily interested in electoral systems, what do these elections tell us about that? Well, there's two things to look at here. The first one Hannah has already expertly spoken about, which is the impact of first past the post. So in English local elections, unlike in Scotland, for example, we still use first past the post for our elections. Although in some cases you can vote for multiple members in a ward, but it's still basically first past the post. And the thing about first past the post is it really benefits the person who comes just ahead. The thing that's really interesting about this is that we didn't used to have first past the post for mayoral elections. So in a couple of places, particularly the new places for combined authority mayors, what might have been quite a different result under the previous system, the two-round system, the supplementary vote, has now become much more like the other first past the post results that we've seen around the country. And if you were going to write a book about any of these local election results, I would seriously recommend the West of England combined authority election, which is it looks not interesting according to the maps because it's gone from Labour to Labour. But the story of how it got there and the different competitions going on, and the Green Party bubbling under the surface, lots of people were saying West of England combined authority could go Green. We were saying that before the election, and then Greens came something like fourth or something. I could be wrong about that, but they were lower down the list, but only by a few percentage points because there was so much going on there. And obviously, what happened with the incumbent candidate leaving under terrible circumstances and all the rest of this. I mean, it was just an extraordinary result, and all of that is only able really to happen in the way that it did because under the previous Conservative central government, the electoral system was reformed from the supplementary vote to first past the post. So we are now seeing mayoral election results that look quite similar to the other quite strange first past the post election results that we get in other places. The third perspective that I want to look at is the kind of comparative political perspective. I realize I'm rattling through these very fast, but we haven't got ages. So if you were looking at this election result from space, it would not look strange at all. You would have seen roughly the same thing happen in Germany, Italy, Switzerland, Austria, France, all over the place. You would have seen local governments slowly going towards the and I use this in a non-judgmental sense, not an evaluative sense, it's just a political science term, but the populist radical right, the populist alternative to the conventional mainstream right. You would have seen that everywhere, and they're taking over local governments in lots and lots of different places, including places that have been historically resilient to it, like Germany. So you've seen the AfD do relatively well. Now, there are questions about how similar reform is to those other parties, but if you're watching from space, you're probably not interested in those nuances. You're just saying, okay, well, it looks like this is happening everywhere. Why wouldn't it also happen in England? And now it has. And also, if you're looking at it from space, you might also say, well, how different is this really from the 2019 European parliamentary election results where the Brexit party did extremely well, or early in the coalition years where UKIP were doing very well? And Hannah has pointed out how different it is in scale, but in quality, it really just demonstrates that the populist radical right vote has to go somewhere. And it looked for a while back in, a decade ago, it was going to UKIP. After that, the Brexit party. After that, it seemed to be absorbed by the two main parties, or particularly the Conservative Party. And now it's gone back out again as the Conservative Party votes dipped. So, we're in a place where, although it looked very, very dramatic on the day, if you're watching from space or watching with a time machine or whatever else, you might think, okay, maybe this is not as weird as it looks. And maybe it's the difference in electoral system that makes it look much more dramatic in England than it does in other places where smaller parties can do very well because of the electoral system. The final thing that I want to talk about is the kind of government angle. So there's a couple of questions that are very, very difficult to answer. The first one is, what will reform look like in local government? And as Jonathan has already pointed out, these are lots of people who have never been councillors before, some people who have never been politicians before, who don't have this political sort of experience that, for example, Conservative county councillors will have done because they've been county councillors for a long time. So they'll come in new. The other thing that's interesting is that they're coming in with these ideological positionings that are somewhat tangentially related to local government. So it's not entirely clear what the main priorities will be. And if you listen to Reform throughout the campaign, you would hear things about diversity, equity, and inclusion, these sorts of things where local government does have some sort of angle. But in comparison to lots and lots of other places around most countries in the world, essentially, most big countries in the world, local government is very institutionally constrained in what it can do in Britain, in England in particular. It's very, very difficult to have a major impact on lots of different policy areas, particularly at the county council level, where 85% of your budget is going on social care. I mean, there's questions there about, for a party that's main interests are in immigration, for example, what can you actually do at a local government level, and what are you going to try to do? So there are some questions around that. I also think, and everyone is going to say this throughout the day, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's what we get lots of questions about, but the reorganization angle, Hannah has already pointed out the importance of becoming organized when it comes to trying to do anything in a council, but equally when it comes to trying to engage with the central government on reorganization. You also have a question of, you have a sort of, I don't know the right word for it, maybe an insurgent political force. So you have a new political force appearing out of nowhere, doing very, very well in a set of local elections, and then the public, who are not tremendously engaged with the process of reorganization, here, well, all these places that you just elected new councillors for, we're going to get rid of them soon. And then you have the question, which you always have with reorganization, about the sort of legitimacy, the electoral legitimacy of the reorganization question, particularly when it's happening, when a Labour central government is essentially doing it to a series of reform councils. So you can end up with some quite difficult, quite nasty political positioning there, would be one of my potential warnings for the future. So I've gone on for absolutely ages there in lots of different ways, but hopefully there were some things there that people found useful and interesting.
Greg, thank you. That's so interesting. And I have to say, I mean, the great thing about these things is I always get fresh perspectives. I did not anticipate, I had never thought that the book to write would be on the West of England mayoral election. I had completely fallen into the trap that you described of thinking, oh, that's the least interesting thing that happened. So that's a real eye opener. I guess a question from me for both of you before we get into questions from the audience. I think that point, so that's a point about some quality versus scale, or scale versus quality of change is really interesting. And what it seems to me you're both describing is a system in which a relatively small change in input creates a massive change in output because of the way the electoral system was. And that feels like a sort of the argument for first past the post has always been that it gives you stability, it gives you, except until it doesn't. And we seem to have got to a system now where first past the post with at least 5 parties sort of competing seriously within it creates really, really big changes, really unpredictable changes on the basis of relatively small changes in voter behavior. Now, that obviously there's a lot of speculation about what that means in terms of national politics. And I'd be interested perhaps in reflections. We've seen elections in Canada and Australia, which seem to have sort of reverted back to more of a sort of 2-party dominance. But I guess what worries me about that is that you actually then build a sort of level of instability and unpredictability and change into local government, and therefore the impact on kind of strategic processes like local government reorganization potentially becomes quite negative, because so I guess to put this as a question, I think what you are saying, both of you, is that these results don't show us, if these elections were rerun in a year's time, or when we have elections in 2 years' time to shadow unitary authorities, or when we have these results, don't necessarily tell us that the same thing would happen again, because very small changes could produce a complete shift back on the map. Is that what you're saying? Hannah, I'll start with you. So that was a vague question addressed to both of you. So Hannah, is that a correct interpretation of your analysis?
Yeah, exactly. I think the first past the post system still does produce a decisive government at whatever level, because you still get that winner's bonus, which means that you get more seats if you do get the most vote share, even if it's a low vote share, as long as it's a plurality, you still get that winner's bonus. So for that term, that period in office, I guess, then you do still have that decisive, can enact their program, whatever system it may, look like. Whereas, if you're having frequent elections, like we often do in many local authorities, then the stability between those periods is actually really, it's unbelievably volatile and really unstable, because just a couple of percentage point change in votes, or even really just a few people staying home, just a couple of families being on holiday, like in some of these areas, that really would completely change the result. So on the one hand, you've got this sort of, decisive, they've won the most votes, they've won the most seats, but on the other hand, it's very fragile and unstable. And if you're having frequent elections, then it's probably going to change from one election to the next.
Yeah. And while there are, some people might argue there are advantages to that, but that is a really big change. If you look at somewhere like Kent, so I'm going to get this wrong, but I believe Kent briefly had a Labour Lib Dem coalition in the mid-90s, but otherwise has been Conservative controlled essentially forever. And if you move into a world in which it could move from being Reform controlled back to Conservative control, back to that is a very, very different world in terms of sort of building long-term political projects.
Yeah, absolutely. And it might foster them to try and work together. But I imagine that that's not the direction that they want to be signaling because of national politics, even though that might be best for the local area.
I'm going to go to the Q&A in a minute, but just quickly before I do, Greg, your point about constraint, I think, is really interesting. Within a county council, so you come into a county council, you say, so much of what you do is set out by statute, is set out by law. As you said, 80-odd% of the budget being spent on social care alone. How do you see that playing out? And is there potential that actually these results open up that debate a bit in some quite interesting ways? Because many people in local government have sort of pushed against that over many years. Said, look, we need more freedom of manoeuvre.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's very difficult to say so looking at the comparative evidence on the populist right as it moves into councils and local government across European countries, and I would recommend the work by Fred Paxton to look into this. But essentially what you've seen in lots of different places is that the populist radical right gets into local government, and then its social agenda is quite constrained by what is possible for local government to do. But what they often have combined with their conservative social agenda is a quite conservative fiscal agenda, which it is more possible to do in local government. And that's true in places like Germany, where you have fiscal levers to pull, But in somewhere like England, if you come in and say, I'm going to slash the council budget because that's what people want me to do, you're going to find there's not much to cut, really. You're going to find there's almost nothing left to cut in most places. And the small amount of discretion that you do have over non-statutory, discretionary spending tends to be, and this is a little bit of a generalization, but things that people quite like. So, parks and libraries, and these libraries are statutory. We don't need to get into that. Libraries are, sorry. We all know about the comprehensive library service, but yeah, parks and museums and these sorts of things where it's more difficult to, I mean, they're visible if you cut them, but also they've been cut already. So that's part of what I'd say on that, is that one of the constraints is fiscal that wouldn't be faced in other European countries to quite the same extent. I think the thing you say about opening up viewpoint diversity is really important, actually, because at the moment, or what it's been for a very, very long time, is all the parties that are the normal parties of local government, which is basically every party, have been saying, in opposition to central government, usually in opposition to a conservative central government in England or an SNP government in Scotland, we can't really do very much because we don't have enough money. And that has been, it's not a particularly, I don't know if it's been particularly convincing because it's difficult. Like, local government doesn't really have a place to display these things. But what you do have now are things like the Mayor's Council, and that's going to have reform voices on it, who may be quite loud voices, like Andrea Jenkins, is going to be a figurehead that reform currently haven't had in the local government sphere. So you might see debate opening up in places like that.
Yeah. And indeed, you may see, we're already seeing noises about legal challenges around them. So there's almost an interesting version where it's almost as a replay. I mean, you would need a sort of political, well, you guys are political historians, but there's almost a kind of inverted replay of some of the battles we saw in the 1980s between the hard left councils and a conservative government. There's a sort of potential for a sort of mirror image of some of those conflicts.
Yeah, like the legal challenges thing about where we can place people in temporary accommodation out of the council and that sort of thing. I mean, that is something that I would expect to sort of become an ongoing issue, although councils have already done it. Councils have already tried to legally challenge this and failed, because when you try to challenge central government as local government, as all of us on this call know, you don't really hold many of the cards, unfortunately.
No, that's true. Right, I am going to go take some questions to the audience. Before I do so, I'm going to apply an unfair restriction on your answers, because I suspect the answer to a lot of these questions is going to be, it's too early to tell. But I'm only going to allow each of you to say that once, and you have to say something else, because obviously we recognize these are early days. So, question: what's this going to mean for the future of LGR and devolution? It is too early to tell, but what's some of the range of potential impacts, do we think? Who wants to? Hannah. I mean,
I'll start off. I mean, I'm less of an expert on that than I think you are, because you're really well connected to obviously the councils that are going through this. But I mean, the knee-jerk reaction from at least some of the media and political spheres was, well, will this even happen at all? Will Labour want to work with reform-led councils? And I think that is probably an extreme reaction and probably less credible as an option now. But it does raise an interesting question about, as Greg was just saying, communicating with central government as this new political force while going through all of these changes. And if you're an inexperienced councillor who, they probably only selected you to stand sort of possibly at the beginning of this year, but probably, February or March time, maybe, it was confirmed to you, you might not have a coherent, concrete view on what local government reorganisation yet. And it's almost certain that they won't have that as a party group in each of these areas. So I think it's going to take a little bit of time to figure out exactly what each of these areas wants and how that might change in terms of the political side of it, at least.
Yeah, and I think, this is not an informed view. This is just my suspicion is, I think the government is too committed to this process to, for it to sort of pull out on the basis that they don't like the shape, the flavour. But it may make differences I think it could make a difference to decisions about geography. And I guess one of the questions, and Hannah, I'm guessing we don't have this data yet, but there will be some quite granular analysis of votes, how people voted across those county councils, and what that looks like in terms of sort of geographical clustering, and how are there some parts of those counties that vote in different ways, and how might that I think it would be very high-minded indeed to think that government will not be looking at that when they come to make decisions about the geography of new unitary councils.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that's also factored into some of the reorganisation plans that have been put forward already, because I mean, here in Devon, there's obviously pockets of sort of Labour support in the two cities, but if you were to aggregate that up all of the time, it's the Conservatives come out on top. And so when you're aggregating those votes, so having a combined authority, the Labour areas don't necessarily want to give up and aggregate all of those votes into one mayor, etc. So but having that reshuffle of all of that now might actually change the makeup of those areas, and it might impact the plans that these local authorities put forward.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just a quick plug for people who are LGRU members: if you want to get up to speed with the state of play in terms of reorganisation, what proposals actually went in, what do they say, what are the sort of various options that are being discussed, you can find all of that on our website. And as a reminder, all of these county councils, areas where elections were held last week, are expected to submit full proposals by the end of November. So it is a relatively short time frame. They're just getting feedback this week from government. Indeed, it has been revised this week. They're getting feedback from government on the interim proposals that went in for the 21st of March. So this is all happening all at once at exactly the same time that these new councillors, whether that's new Liberal Democrat leadership in Cambridgeshire or new Reform leadership in Kent, or at exactly the same time they are trying to get to grips with running a large, hundred of millions pound budget county council, they are going to have to be engaging with the shape of those proposals. So it is a very, very tough ask. It's going to be a very busy summer for all of those people. A couple more questions. So, Greg, one for you. I'm saying these in a slightly different order. So the question from Emma: Reform seemed quite centralised, she says, and it was particularly focused around Nigel Farage as the leader. How do we think that will play out with Reform running councils across the country in different environments with different local needs? And it's certainly a theme that we've been picking up in sort of very early discussions this week, is that there does seem to be quite a lot of sort of control coming from Reform HQ. Now, we know from Conservative, Labour, Lib Dems, the capacity of sort of central office to assert its will across a large number of councils and a large number of councillors. That is a challenge. But do we have any sense yet of how that might play out?
Well, first I want to say that it is perceptive to point out that Reform are very, very centralised in comparison to most political parties. I mean, and partly that's been because of their sort of deficit in elected representatives. I mean, it's quite easy to be very centralised when you have whatever it is, 4 MPs most of the time that you've been around. The Brexit Party was similarly centralised. And I think that is likely to start changing as the number of elected representatives increases. I mean, there are now credible alternative voices in Reform to Nigel Farage, which there weren't previously. So you can look to people like Andrea Jenkins or Lee Anderson in the Parliamentary Party as being other people who can go out and say things. Whereas previously in the Brexit Party iteration of the populist radical right Farage's party, there was nobody else. I mean, it was essentially the Nigel Farage show until he decided. I mean, UKIP was the Nigel Farage show until he decided to leave, and then UKIP fell apart almost immediately. So it is unusually centralised. As to how this plays out, I think we'll see a quite rapid decentralisation of Reform as people start to grapple with local issues. I don't know whether that will be. Yeah, I think I have to just say that I have absolutely no idea what the overall effect of that will be, considering that local councillors do have to do some work. I mean, there's no way that you can. The entire Reform message being around these sort of big ticket issues. Previously it was Brexit, now it's primarily immigration. That will be very hard to have conversations on the doorstep about when it comes to local elections. So yeah, I mean, I expect that it will be a complex factor for reform to navigate.
But right, and there's also, I guess, linking back to the previous discussion, there are things on which, so hypothetically, you come into power in a county council without a firm view on local government reorganisation. Well, you could choose to say, well, that's not something but actually you can't not play that game because those proposals have to go in. So, and that will happen at the end of November. So either it will happen and you won't have put a proposal in, and therefore, so something is going to happen. So you can't choose not to kind of engage. There will have to be engagement with it. There'll have to be engagement with it across those, whatever it is, 10 councils. Yeah. So either central office is going to have to do a lot of work and maintain a sort of view across all those councils, or they're going to have to let places do it. But not doing that just simply means that someone else that it will happen without them. So it is going to be, yeah. So I think we can say that we don't know how it's going to play out, but we can be pretty confident that it is going to be a factor in what happens next.
I also think another unknown variable is whether Nigel Farage decides to remain as the leader of Reform. I mean, at the moment, it looks like he definitely will because its fortunes are on the rise and all the rest of it. But he has joined and left the various parties to their own devices at different times before. And he wasn't even really he wasn't the leader of Reform as they went into the 2024 general election until very late in the day. So, I mean, it's their level of centralization around a single figure is sort of more questionable when that single figure has gone in and out of that central location.
Yeah, that's interesting. Hannah, question about representation. What do these results mean for you've spoken very, very powerfully in the previous panels about numbers of women in local government, numbers of minorities in local government, age, young people, the sort of the extent to which local government does or doesn't reflect the communities it serves. Do we know anything yet about what these results mean for demographic representation?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to have to play my "it's too early to tell" card. But I mean, we can guess that most people who are Reform representatives or Reform candidates were sort of aged between kind of 45 and 60, male and white British. So we can take a good estimation that, most of those councillors that were elected also fit that sort of demographic profile. In terms of who actually voted for them, that is slightly more diverse than the candidates they put forward, but we will just sort of have to wait and see, really, and pick up the analysis in a couple of months' time.
Absolutely. Well, we'll have you back for that. And to be fair, the question itself says, "Is it too early to tell?" So I think it's very legitimate to play that card. For both of you, a question from Ingrid. We've talked quite a lot about the challenges that parties, particularly some populist parties, face around the systemic constraint, the small voting margins. But are there any aspects of the English system that kind of gives a particular advantage to parties who are coming in either, so from outside the main three, either from the right or the left? Is there stuff around, how elections are administered? Is there stuff around, the fact that councils don't have much money to spend that actually plays in to, that gives advantages to smaller parties? Let's start with Greg.
Yeah, so this is a great question. And I think there's lots of literature in the United States about this sort of attempted hollowing out of public institutions by the populist radical right in the US, the sort of that wing of the Republican Party. And I think the difference with the English sort of situation that we find ourselves in is that there is a very strong mechanism by which councils can be forced to comply with certain spending rules and that sort of thing. So if a council says, I'm going to cut all our spending on temporary, if say a Reform council says, because of ideological reasons, I'm going to cut our spending on temporary accommodation and move families out of the area, that's just a scenario. No one has really suggested exactly that. But the Section 114 officer, the chief finance officer will issue a Section 114 notice for illegal spending, essentially. And then the central government has the capacity to send commissioners in a way that they couldn't do for the Department of the Environment in the United States, for example. It's much more difficult, I would say, or it should be institutionally more difficult to sort of hollow out the functions of local government because central government is so powerful in comparison, and because there are mechanisms in place to stop that. I think the administration of elections, which is of course what I did my PhD on and something I'm very interested in, is another case where it's much more centrally defined than it appears to be from the outside. So it would be harder in this case to make it very difficult to validate the results of an election, for example, because all election costs can be recouped from central government. So it is. I mean, it's not impossible that could be made difficult, but it will be much, much harder than, for example, in the US, where it is much more political. So I think there are cases where local government, in a very, very odd way, its weakness is its strength, where, if you are that close to bankruptcy, then any significant, attempts to curtail spending or whatever else will result in this mechanism being implemented.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, look, Greg, we wouldn't have wanted to send you home without an electoral administration question.
Yeah.
Hannah, anything to add to
that? Just to mirror it, really, because I think when there are some local authorities, across different countries where the tax and spend powers are really quite substantial, and so you can come in and make some radical changes and then either get electorally sort of punished or rewarded for that. Whereas, the scope just isn't really the same here, especially in English councils. So it's going to be interesting to see if there is an awareness of that about these new councillors, or whether they're going to try and go and do something and then actually be like, oh, we can't do this, so how are we going to get a policy platform together, or now that we're learning these constraints?
Yeah, and look, this is going to be something that senior officers are going to be worried about, frankly. I mean, I'm already worried about is that they're going to spend a lot of their time kind of explaining what can and can't lawfully be done within councils, given the level of given the very low levels of discretion around council operations and spending. So that is certainly going to be, I suspect, a sort of at least an internal battle within councils. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how far that does or does not, or in what ways that spills out into a sort of public-facing political battle. Greg?
Yeah, I just want to say I've given quite a conservative answer there that sort of suggests that everything will definitely be fine. And I want to just put the other case, which is that if your only intention, and I'm not saying that this is the case with reform at all, but if your only intention was to make a local government as ineffective as possible, you would also be able to do that. If you went in and said, what we're going to do is slash council tax to nothing, and then you get a 114 notice straight away, and then you get commissioners coming in, and your local democracy ceases to function as a local democracy immediately. If you wanted to do that, and I don't see any reason why a council would, it would be possible. It's just that it would put you in a situation where, I mean, if local accountability is working at all, it would be fairly plainly obvious that that's what you've done. It's just that if you were only a blocker, if your only intention was to make things as hard as possible for local government, then you could do that. I mean, I don't want to be alarmist, but I just want to say that is something that, in the most extreme parts of the populist radical right in other countries, you have seen attempts like that.
Right. So I guess just to sort of frame that back to you, local government is incredibly resilient, but is not completely immune to, could be sort of brought to a grinding halt by people who just didn't want to play the game. And if they, and again, I guess echoes of some of the things we saw happening in the 1980s, where if you choose to use the failure of local government to make a broader national political point, those routes are available, though very destructive. And the question then becomes about, do you, as the left did not have in the 1980s, do you have a sort of a route through a political narrative that turns that to your advantage? And I think perhaps one of the lessons of the 80s is that is very, very challenging, and people, the public tend to sort of see through that. I'm going to pick up quickly a further question which picks up some of those issues, because one of the things that I think we would often say about local government is that while it is a party political atmosphere, and while I'm not going to sit here and say that local government is this sort of hand-holding sort of entirely collaborative, sort of all sweetness and light environment. It isn't always, but actually we do see, I think, in local government a lot more cross-party collaboration, a lot, because it's so place-based, a lot more focus on pragmatism and outcomes. And I guess do these elections raise a question about that? As we get, and again, not to sort of put it on a particular party, but as we get more, as we move, as it seems to me you're both saying we are, to a sort of less stable five-party system, does that put at risk the sort of collaboration and pragmatism that we've seen in local government historically? Start with Hannah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because, I mean, as you show in your State of the Locals polling, local government is often more trusted than national government, pretty much across the board. It doesn't matter how you ask that question. But one of the reasons for that is because it's less adversarial, it's less party political, it's more collaborative and more about the place and working together for the local area.
Yeah.
So if that does start to break down because of ideological differences or even just organizational differences, again, where you've got these established parties who are saying, look, please listen to us. We can't do this. We need to work together, or whatever it might be. And then you get that resistance from these new councillors, which, the reform, then actually that could not just negatively impact the running of the council, but if that comes out in the public eye, then it could end up decreasing the trust in local government and making it more adversarial and party political.
That's right, and that's something we've written a lot at LJU about how, if we're going to rebuild trust in politics, the only place we can start is local government, because it does start from a better position. But that makes that, a really something to worry about. Look, we're getting defeated by time. I'm going to flip the sort of it's too early to tell to ask you both a closing reflection on, given that it is too early to tell about so much, what are the one or two things that you are going to be looking out for over the coming weeks and months? What are the things that you've got your eye on that you think will be that will shed further light on all of this as we go forward? Let's start with Greg and then closing word from Hannah.
I'm going to steal the sort of easier one then, I suppose, which is to look at how reform councils deal with the reorganisation question, what they start to do with these proposals, and whether there's any change in sort of tactics on that side, and how the central government responds. I think that's kind of what I'll be most looking out for.
Yeah. Hannah, anything else?
Yeah, very much that, and how this this conversation between the parties sort of happens, and how the local fight back for the Conservatives in most of these areas sort of happens, and whether these reform councils and reform as a party start to have regional or sub-regional identities still within reform, because that Labour and the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats all do. Whereas if reform manage that, then they could be a lasting force in local government. Whereas if they don't, I think they're going to find it difficult.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yes, that is definitely, and I guess that feels, because that's so long established in Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrat politics, I just have no idea how long we would or wouldn't expect that to take. How long does that kind of local identity formation, political local identity formation take to happen? I mean, we've had decades and decades and decades for all the other parties, so that's going to be interesting to watch. Look, we are out of time, so thank you both. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Hannah. Really, really interesting insights. As always, I've learned a lot from listening to both of you, so I'm very grateful, and I'm sure everyone else on the call has found it interesting as well. Thank you to all of you for coming, whether you're here live with us this morning or watching on catch up. I hope you found that interesting. There is a feedback form, so do please fill it in, and we will be sending out a resource pack just to remind you that resources for, if you are in a council with new councillors coming in, we have huge amounts of resources for new councillors available on the LJU website. If you are a new councillor or an existing councillor or officer trying to make sense of LGR and devolution, we have huge amounts of resources trying to sort of navigate through that as well. So those are there for you. Do please take advantage of those. This, as I said at the beginning, is a member-only event. These are things we do to support our members to understand what are interesting, fast-moving, and as we've heard, in some ways quite unpredictable times. So thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks again to Greg and Hannah. Thank you all.